November 19th, 1274. The morning mist clung to Hakata Bay on the northern coast of Kyushu as Takazaki Suenaga, a 28-year-old samurai warrior from Higo province, gripped the reins of his horse and stared toward the horizon. Behind him, thousands of Japanese warriors waited in loose formations along the beach, their lacquered armor gleaming in the pale dawn light. Before them, emerging from the grey waters like a vision from hell, came the largest invasion fleet Japan had ever seen. 900 ships, their hulls dark against the sky, carrying 40,000 warriors from the Mongol Empire, the most powerful military force the world had ever known. The warriors of Japan, armed with their curved, touchy swords and generations of martial tradition, were about to face an enemy unlike anything in their history. What they didn't know yet was that this encounter would fundamentally transform Japanese warfare, sword design, and the very soul of the samurai class. The clash that was about to unfold would become one of the defining moments in Japanese history, a collision between two radically different philosophies of war, two incompatible visions of combat, two weapons that represented entirely different approaches to the art of killing. The story begins 7 years earlier, in 1268, when diplomatic envoys from Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and emperor of the Yuan dynasty, arrived in Japan bearing a letter. The message was polite in its phrasing, but unmistakable in its intent. The great Khan recognized the ruler of Japan as the king of this island nation and expressed his sincere desire to foster friendly relations between their peoples. But beneath the diplomatic language lay a thinly veiled threat. The Khan hoped, he wrote, that the use of arms could be avoided, but tribute must be paid to the Mongol court. Japan, in other words, must submit or face the consequences. The Japanese government, led by the Kamakura shogunate under the 18-year-old regent Hojo Tokimune, faced an impossible decision. For centuries Japan had existed in relative isolation, its warrior class honing their skills against each other in the internal conflicts, but never facing a foreign invader. The samurai of 1268 were the product of generations of refinement, their martial traditions shaped by uniquely Japanese concepts of honor, individual combat, and the spiritual connection between warrior and weapon. They wore their long, touchy swords suspended from their belts with the cutting edge down. The blades averaging 70 to 80 centimeters in length, curved elegantly for devastating cuts from horseback. These swords were more than weapons. They were believed to contain the soul of the warrior who wielded them, forged by master swordsmiths using techniques passed down through centuries. The samurai's approach to warfare was equally refined and ritualistic. By the 13th century, Japanese warriors favored a style of combat that would seem almost incomprehensible to foreign observers. A samurai would ride out toward the enemy, announce his name, his lineage, his notable deeds, and then challenge an opposing warrior to single combat. This wasn't merely theatrics, it was the fundamental nature of how Japanese warriors fought. Battle was a series of individual duels, opportunities for warriors to prove their skill and courage, to earn recognition and reward from their lords. The idea of anonymous mass combat, of soldiers fighting as interchangeable units in a formation, was alien to the samurai mindset. When Kublai Khan's envoys arrived with their demands for submission, the Japanese simply didn't respond. Not with refusal, not with acceptance, just silence. The envoys returned to China empty-handed. More embassies followed in 1269, 1270, 1271, each met with the same stony silence. The Japanese government seemed paralyzed, unable to formulate a response to this unprecedented situation. Were they afraid? Arrogant? Simply unable to comprehend the scale of the threat they faced? Historical records suggest confusion more than anything else. The Japanese had never dealt with a power like the Mongol Empire. They had no framework for understanding what was coming. But young Hojo Tokimune understood enough to begin preparations. He ordered Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples throughout Japan to offer prayers for the repulsion of foreign troops. He suspended most of the government's regular duties to focus on defense. Most importantly, he tried to unite the fractious samurai clans of Western Japan, ending feuds and organizing them into a coherent defensive force. It was an enormous task. The samurai served individual lords, not a unified military structure. Getting them to coordinate would prove nearly impossible. Meanwhile, in China, Kublai Khan's patience had run out. If diplomacy would not bring Japan into his empire, then force would. In April 1274, he ordered the mobilization of troops for invasion. The force would consist of 15,000 Mongol, Han Chinese and Yurchen soldiers, 6,000 to 8,000 Korean troops, and 7,000 Korean sailors. The Korean kingdom of Goryeo, recently subjugated by the Mongols, was forced to construct the fleet. 900 ships of varying sizes, from massive transport vessels to swift landing craft, all built in the shipyards of southern Korea. The invasion fleet was scheduled to depart in the 7th lunar month of 1274, but delays pushed the launch to September. On October 3, 1274, the armada finally set sail, heading east across the Korean Strait toward the Japanese islands. Their first targets were Tsushima and Iki, two small islands between Korea and Kyushu. On Tsushima, the local lord Sosukakuni took 80 warriors to Komoda Beach to meet the invaders. What happened next set the pattern for everything that would follow. The Japanese warriors, following their traditional approach, rode forward to issue challenges and seek individual combat. The Mongol forces responded with massed volleys of arrows fired by hundreds of archers acting in unison. Then came something the Japanese had never seen: ceramic shells packed with gunpowder that exploded with deafening roars, killing horses and men, sowing confusion and terror. The Japanese were overwhelmed. Sosukakuni and most of his men were killed. The islands fell quickly, their populations massacred or enslaved. The Mongol fleet moved on toward Kyushu. On November 19, 1274, they entered Hakata Bay. This was where Takazaki Suenaga and thousands of other samurai waited. The Japanese defensive plan, such as it was, called for local lords to contest the invaders at every opportunity. There was no unified command structure, no coordinated battle plan, just a loose understanding that Japanese warriors would fight the enemy wherever they landed. As the Mongol fleet anchored in the bay and landing craft began ferrying soldiers to shore, the first engagements began, and immediately, everything the samurai thought they knew about warfare fell apart. The Japanese tradition of opening battle involved a signalling arrow, a whistling shaft with a perforated wooden head that announced the beginning of combat. At Hakata Bay, a 12-year-old grandson of a Japanese commander fired that arrow toward the Mongol lines. It was meant to be ceremonial, a traditional gesture before the real fighting began. The Mongols responded with massive volleys of arrows from their powerful composite bows, hundreds of shafts filling the air in coordinated waves. While Japanese archers fired individually, selecting specific targets, the Mongols shot together, creating killing zones where survival was impossible. Then samurai warriors would ride forward to issue their challenges, announcing their names and lineages, seeking worthy opponents for single combat. But the Mongols had no interest in individual duels. They fought in tight formations, small units of 10 to 100 warriors operating with coordinated precision. As a samurai approached to make his challenge, he would be immediately surrounded by Mongol soldiers and cut down by multiple attackers. The Japanese concept of honorable combat meant nothing to an enemy that viewed battle as a practical problem to be solved through superior tactics and overwhelming force. Takazaki Suenaga, whose own commissioned scrolls would later provide the only eyewitness pictorial account of these battles, experienced this firsthand. He had been ordered by his commander Muto Kagesuke to pull back and wait, but Suenaga disobeyed, declaring that he and his men from Higo province would be the first to engage the enemy. He charged toward a group of Mongol soldiers, expecting them to respond according to the rules of warfare he understood. Instead, he and his brother-in-law Mitsui Sukanaga found themselves facing the main Mongol army, a coordinated mass of warriors who attacked not as individuals but as a unified force. The Mongols employed weapons and tactics that seemed almost supernatural to the Japanese. Their composite bows, short enough to be fired from horseback or on foot, had greater range than Japanese bows and could penetrate Japanese armor at distances the samurai considered impossible. Their arrows were tipped with poison, making even glancing wounds potentially fatal. They threw explosives, ceramic shells filled with gunpowder that detonated with thunderous blasts, terrifying horses and men alike. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese warriors, trained since childhood in the mounted combat traditions of their ancestors, found themselves helpless against an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. When they tried to close for sword combat, where the reach and cutting power of the tachi should have given them advantage. They were met by coordinated spearwork from Mongol infantry fighting in mutually supporting groups. The Mongols moved to the sound of gongs and drums, their units responding to signals with practiced precision, advancing and retreating in coordinated waves. The Japanese fought as individuals, each warrior seeking his own glory, with no real coordination beyond loose understanding of who commanded whom. But in those first desperate hours of combat, something else became apparent. When Japanese warriors did manage to close to sword range, when they broke through the arrow storms and explosive terror weapons, their tachi proved devastatingly effective. These long-curved blades, products of centuries of metallurgical refinement, could cut through the hardened leather armour worn by most Mongol soldiers with shocking ease. A single properly executed strike from a tachi could sever limbs, split skulls, open massive wounds that killed instantly or left men bleeding to death on the battlefield. The tachi of the Kamakura period were masterworks of the swordsmith's art. Forged from traditional Tamahagan steel through a complex process of repeated folding and differential hardening, they possessed a combination of hardness and flexibility that made them incredibly resilient. The curved single edge, with its razor-sharp cutting surface backed by a softer, more flexible spine, could absorb impact without shattering while delivering cuts of extraordinary power. These blades ranged from 70 to 80 centimeters in length, worn suspended from the warrior's belt with the cutting edge facing downward. This orientation allowed for powerful drawing cuts, the samurai pulling the sword up and out in a single fluid motion that could strike an enemy before the blade fully cleared the scabbard. The problem at Hakata Bay wasn't the effectiveness of Japanese swords, it was getting close enough to use them. Takazaki Suinaga and his flag-bearer had their horses shot from under them by Mongol arrows before they could reach the enemy lines. They found themselves on foot, facing volleys of arrows and explosive devices, saved only when another samurai named Shiraishi Michiyasu led a cavalry charge that bought them time to retreat. By nightfall on November 19th, the Japanese defenders had been pushed several miles inland from the beaches. The Mongol forces controlled 3 main landing zones around Hakata Bay, with the central position at Torikai serving as their strongest foothold. Thousands of Mongol, Chinese and Korean warriors had come ashore, establishing a beachhead for what appeared to be a full-scale invasion. The Japanese had suffered heavy casualties, their traditional fighting methods proving catastrophically inadequate against the Mongol way of war. The samurai were not cowards, they had fought with desperate courage, but courage alone couldn't overcome the tactical superiority of an enemy that had conquered half the known world. Then something unexpected happened. During the night, the Mongol forces withdrew to their ships. Why they made this decision remains debated by historians. Some sources claim they intended to advance further inland but were concerned about Japanese reinforcements or running low on arrows after the day's fighting. Others suggest internal disagreements between Mongol commanders and their reluctant Korean and Chinese subordinates. Whatever the reason, by the morning of November the 20th, the invasion fleet had pulled back into Hakata Bay. That night a storm struck. Contemporary accounts vary wildly on its severity. Some Japanese sources describe it as a devastating typhoon that destroyed a third of the Mongol fleet. Chinese and Korean records make almost no mention of significant weather. Modern historians suggest it was probably a autumn gale, serious enough to damage ships but not the catastrophic divine wind that later mythology would describe. What's clear is that the storm provided the Mongols with an excuse to withdraw. By November 21st, the invasion fleet was sailing back to Korea. They left behind hundreds of dead and a thoroughly shaken Japanese defensive force. In the aftermath, both sides drew very different lessons from the battle. The Mongol commanders reported to Kublai Khan that Japan could be conquered, but would require a larger force and better preparation. The Japanese defensive performance had been disorganized but not ineffective once they adapted to Mongol tactics. The Japanese reached a more disturbing conclusion. Their entire martial tradition, everything the samurai class believed about warfare and honor, had nearly gotten them annihilated. Young Hojo Tokimune understood that the Mongols would return, and when they did, Japan needed to be fundamentally different. In the 7 years between the first and second Mongol invasions, Japan transformed itself. The government organized a massive construction project, building a stone wall around the entire coastline of Hakata Bay. This wall, completed in 1276, stretched 20 kilometers and stood 2 to 3 meters high in places. The inner side was sloped to allow mounted archers to ride up and fire over the top, while the outer face was sheer, designed to prevent easy landings. Japanese warriors drilled in new tactics. They learned to fight in coordinated groups rather than as individuals. They practiced night raids and ambush tactics rather than open field challenges. Most importantly, they studied their weapons in light of what they had learned about Mongol armor and fighting techniques. This is where the true revolution in Japanese swordsmithing began. After the Battle of 1274, swordsmiths throughout Japan received reports of swords that had broken or bent during combat with Mongol forces. The traditional tachi, while devastating against unarmored or lightly armored opponents, showed vulnerabilities when repeatedly striking the hardened leather armor worn by many Mongol soldiers. The blades could chip, bend, or even break under the stress of sustained combat against heavily armored enemies. In Sagami Province, where the Kamakura shogunate maintained its seat of power, master swordsmiths began gathering. The shogunate invited craftsmen from the prestigious Yamashiro and Bizen schools to study the problem. Among them was a swordsmith named Shintogo Kunimitsu, who began experimental work combining the forging techniques of different schools. His student, a craftsman who would become known simply as Masamune, would revolutionize Japanese sword-making. Masamune and his contemporaries in what became known as the Soshu school began studying damaged tachi from the Mongol invasion, examining where and why they had failed. They developed new forging techniques that addressed these weaknesses, by using a more sophisticated combination of hard and soft steel. By optimizing the temperatures and timing of heating and cooling during forging, they created blades that were simultaneously harder and more flexible than anything that had come before. The new blades were lighter, but more robust. The curve of the blade became more gentle, moving from the deep koshizori curve concentrated near the hilt to a more distributed nakazori that spread the curve along the blade's length. The tip was lengthened linearly, creating better penetrating power against armor. The blade was widened from cutting edge to spine, improving structural strength, while the cross-section was thinned to enhance cutting ability without sacrificing resilience. These innovations represented lessons learned in blood at Hakata Bay. The swordsmiths of the Soshu school were, in effect, creating weapons specifically designed to fight Mongol warriors. But they wouldn't get to test their new designs until 1281, when Kublai Khan made good on his promise to return. After the first invasion, the Khan sent more envoys to Japan, again demanding submission. This time, Hojo Tokimun's response was clear and unambiguous. He had the envoys executed, their heads displayed as a message to the Mongol emperor. If Khan wanted Japan, he would have to take it by force. The second invasion fleet was staggering in scale. The Khan ordered 2 separate forces assembled. The Eastern Force, launching from Korea, numbered 40,000 men on 900 ships. The Southern Force, departing from ports in recently conquered Song China, carried 100,000 troops on over 3,000 vessels. Together, they represented one of the largest seaborne invasions in world history up to that point, a combined force of 140,000 warriors in more than 4,000 ships. The Japanese, meanwhile, could muster perhaps 40,000 defenders, mostly concentrated around northern Kyushu. On paper, it looked like a mismatch that would end in inevitable Japanese defeat. But the Japan of 1281 was not the Japan of 1274. On June 8, 1281, the Eastern Force struck Tsushima again. The island's defenders fought with desperate skill but were overwhelmed by the Mongol numbers and forced back. The same fate befell Iki Island. By June 23rd, both advance forces from Korea and China were approaching Hakata Bay, intending to rendezvous and launch a coordinated assault on the Japanese mainland. They found the coast transformed. The massive stone wall prevented easy landing at the beaches the Mongols had used in 1274. Japanese forces were organized, disciplined, ready. When Mongol troops attempted to come ashore, they faced coordinated resistance from defenders who had learned from their previous defeat. More importantly, the Japanese had learned the value of taking the fight to the enemy. Throughout late June and early July, small Japanese ships launched night raids against the anchored Mongol fleet. Samurai warriors like Kawano Michiari, Takazaki Suenaga, and Kusano Jiro led these attacks, using small, fast boats to approach the larger Mongol vessels under cover of darkness, then boarding them with swords drawn. These raids were nothing like the formal challenges of traditional samurai warfare. They were brutal, pragmatic attacks designed to kill as many enemies as possible and destroy as many ships as they could reach. Here, in close quarters combat on the decks of ships, the Japanese tachi proved its worth decisively. The long curved blades had devastating reach advantage in confined spaces. A samurai wielding a tachi with proper technique could strike enemies beyond the range of shorter weapons. The cutting power was extraordinary, severing arms and heads with single strikes, opening wounds that left men bleeding to death within minutes. Takazaki Suenaga, now 7 years older and considerably more experienced, participated in these night raids with calculated ferocity. His illustrated scrolls, commissioned years later to document his deeds, show him and other samurai boarding Mongol vessels, cutting down defenders, taking heads as proof of their kills. The scrolls depict the chaos of ship-to-ship combat, the flames from burning vessels, the bodies falling into dark water. These were not honourable duels between worthy opponents. This was war stripped of ceremony, reduced to its essential brutality. The Mongol commanders found themselves in an impossible situation. They couldn't maintain their position at sea while suffering constant raids. They couldn't land their forces in strength because of the defensive walls and coordinated Japanese resistance. Their huge army sat on ships in Hakata Bay, unable to bring its numerical superiority to bear, bleeding casualties every night to Japanese raids. The situation dragged on through June, into July, then early August. The Mongol forces had expected to land, overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers, and march inland to subjugate Japan. Instead, they were trapped, unable to advance or retreat without admitting defeat. Then, on August 15th, 1281, nature intervened decisively. A massive typhoon, a true divine wind, struck Hakata Bay with devastating force. The Mongol fleet, with thousands of ships anchored close together for mutual defence, was catastrophically vulnerable. The storm drove ships against each other and against the rocky shore. Vessels that had seemed massive and powerful were smashed to kindling. Men drowned by the thousands as ships capsized or broke apart. When the typhoon finally passed, the destruction was total. Contemporary estimates suggest that half or more of the 140,000-man invasion force died in the storm. Most of the ships were destroyed. The survivors who struggled ashore, dazed and weaponless, were hunted down and killed by Japanese forces over the following days. Only a fraction of the original invasion force made it back to China and Korea. The Mongol Empire, which had conquered from Hungary to Korea, had been decisively defeated by a combination of Japanese resistance and catastrophic weather. Kublai Khan would plan a third invasion but never launch it. Distracted by campaigns in Southeast Asia, and eventually giving up on Japan entirely. The invasions left Japan fundamentally transformed. The cost of maintaining defences and compensating warriors nearly bankrupted the shogunate. Many samurai who had fought with distinction found themselves unrewarded because the government lacked resources. This created resentment that would eventually contribute to the fall of the Kamakura shogunate in 1333. But the invasions also created a powerful mythology that would shape Japanese culture for centuries. The storms that destroyed the Mongol fleets became known as kamikaze, divine winds, proof that the gods themselves protected Japan from foreign conquest. This belief in divine protection would persist all the way through World War II, when Japanese pilots adopted the kamikaze name for their suicide attacks. More practically, the invasions revolutionized Japanese warfare and weaponry. The lessons of fighting Mongol forces, the necessity of coordinated tactics over individual glory-seeking, the need for weapons that could defeat heavily armoured enemies, all of this drove innovation that would define samurai culture for the next 300 years. The swords evolved most dramatically. The innovations of Masamune and the Soshu school, directly inspired by analysing blades damaged or broken fighting Mongol forces, set new standards for Japanese swordsmithing that persist even today. The blades became stronger, more resilient, better balanced. The forging techniques developed in this era are still considered the peak of the swordsmith's art. Later periods would see the development of the katana proper, shorter than the tachi and worn with the cutting edge facing up for faster drawing. But the fundamental metallurgy, the sophisticated understanding of how to combine hard and soft steel to create blades that were simultaneously rigid and flexible, sharp and resilient, all of this came from the innovations sparked by the Mongol invasions. The tachi that faced the Mongol invaders in 1274 and 1281 represented centuries of Japanese sword-making tradition. The blades that emerged from the lessons of those battles represented a leap forward in that tradition, weapons refined through the crucible of combat against the most formidable military force the world had yet seen. When historians study the Mongol invasions of Japan, they often focus on the kamikaze, the divine winds that destroyed the invasion fleets. This makes for compelling narrative but misses the deeper truth. The Japanese didn't simply get lucky with weather. They learned, adapted, and fought with increasing effectiveness against an enemy that had crushed every other opponent. The samurai of 1281 were not the same warriors who had been overwhelmed at Hakata Bay in 1274. They had learned to fight in coordinated groups. They had learned the value of night raids and ambush tactics. They had learned that survival mattered more than individual glory. And they carried swords that were incrementally better, stronger, more effective than the blades of 7 years earlier. The tachi and its descendant, the katana, would become symbols of the samurai class, objects of spiritual significance and artistic beauty. But we should never forget that these were weapons, tools designed for killing, refined through generations of combat experience and through specific lessons learned fighting Mongol invaders in 2 desperate campaigns. When Takazaki Suenaga commissioned his scrolls depicting the invasions, he was creating a personal record of his deeds in battle, seeking recognition and reward for his service. But he was also creating a historical document of immense value, the only eyewitness pictorial account of how Japanese warriors fought Mongol forces, how they died and killed, how they adapted and survived. The scrolls show samurai on horseback, their long tachi drawn, facing volleys of Mongol arrows. They show the chaos of night raids on enemy ships, swords rising and falling in the darkness. They show the explosions of Mongol gunpowder weapons, something completely new to Japanese warfare. And they show, again and again, the moment when blade met flesh, when the centuries of sword-making tradition proved its worth in the most brutal test possible. The Mongol invasions mark a pivotal moment in Japanese history, the point when Japan faced potential foreign conquest and survived through a combination of military adaptation and natural catastrophe. The samurai tachi, that elegant curved blade suspended from the warrior's belt, was tested against Mongol armor, Mongol tactics, Mongol weapons, and found to be effective when wielded properly, when its strengths were understood and its weaknesses addressed through innovation in forging and tactics. The stories that emerged from the invasions, the mythology of divine protection, the legends of individual heroism, all of this would shape Japanese culture for 700 years. But beneath the legend lies a harder truth. Japan survived because its warriors learned to fight differently, because its swordsmiths made better weapons, because the samurai class proved capable of adaptation when faced with existential threat. The transformation of the tachi in response to combat experience against Mongol forces represents one of history's clearest examples of how warfare drives technological innovation. The blades that emerged from the forges of the Soshu school in the late 13th and early 14th centuries represented the pinnacle of sword-making technology anywhere in the world at that time. No contemporary European, Middle Eastern, or Asian blade could match the combination of hardness, flexibility, and cutting power achieved by masters like Masamune. This superiority wasn't theoretical. It was earned through analysis of actual combat performance, through studying how blades performed against Mongol armor, through understanding exactly what made a sword break or bend and designing solutions to prevent those failures. The samurai who faced Mongol invaders at Hakata Bay in 1274 and 1281 were fighting for their lives, for their families, for their way of life. They were also, though they didn't know it, participating in a crucible that would refine Japanese military culture and technology for centuries to come. When we examine the Mongol invasions of Japan, we should remember not just the dramatic storms that destroyed invasion fleets, but the hundreds of individual combats where samurai and Mongol warriors faced each other with drawn swords and spears, where the long-curved tachi cut through leather armor and flesh, where Japanese steel met Mongol steel, and Japanese technique met Mongol tactics. In those moments of desperate violence, in night raids on enemy ships and defensive stands behind newly built walls, the samurai class discovered its ability to adapt and survive. The swords they carried, refined through centuries of tradition, and then improved through the harsh lessons of combat against foreign invaders, became symbols of that survival, objects that embodied not just martial skill, but cultural resilience. The tachi that first faced Mongol invaders in 1274 came from a warrior tradition that emphasized individual combat and ritualized challenge. The blades that emerged from the invasion era, informed by the innovations of smiths like Masamune, were weapons designed for a more brutal and practical style of warfare. Both were products of the samurai culture that created them. Both served their purpose in the defense of Japan against foreign conquest. And both deserve to be remembered not just as beautiful objects or cultural symbols, but as tools of war that were tested in the most demanding crucible possible and found adequate to the task. The thunder that echoed across Hakata Bay in November 1274 and August 1281 was not just the sound of Mongol drums or exploding gunpowder weapons. It was the sound of two military cultures colliding, of Japanese traditions being tested and transformed by contact with the wider world. The samurai survived that test. Their swords, evolving in response to lessons learned in blood and fire, became better weapons because of it. And Japan, having faced the most powerful empire on earth and survived, emerged with a strengthened belief in its own unique character and divine protection. Whether that survival owed more to military adaptation or fortunate weather, to improved swords or timely storms, remains debatable. What's certain is that the Mongol invasions changed Japan forever, and the tachi swords that faced Mongol warriors in those desperate battles carried lessons learned from that conflict forward into the future of the samurai class. The surviving samurai who returned from the battles of 1274 and 1281 brought back more than just wounds and glory. They carried detailed knowledge of how Mongol forces fought, what worked against them, and critically, what didn't. This information spread through the warrior class like wildfire, transforming training methods and combat philosophy throughout Japan. In the decades following the invasions, dojos across the country began incorporating lessons from the Mongol wars into their curriculum. The emphasis shifted from purely formal kata and ritualized dueling to more practical combat scenarios. Samurai trained to fight multiple opponents simultaneously, practice maintaining formation discipline, and learn to coordinate attacks rather than seeking individual glory. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in how warriors thought about their swords. Before the invasions, the relationship between samurai and sword was deeply spiritual but somewhat abstract. The blade was the soul of the warrior, a sacred object, an heirloom passed through generations. After the invasions, that spiritual connection gained a practical dimension. Warriors who had seen their blades chip or break against Mongol armor understood viscerally that the quality of their sword could mean the difference between life and death. This created unprecedented demand for superior blades and elevated the status of master swordsmiths to levels approaching that of the warriors themselves. Masamune, working in Kamakura during the late 13th and early 14th centuries, became the most celebrated of these craftsmen. His blades, characterized by their intricate crystalline patterns in the steel and their exceptional balance of hardness and flexibility, were sought after by the most powerful warriors in Japan. A Masamune blade wasn't just a weapon, it was proof of status, wealth, and connection to the defining military experience of the era. The technical innovations Masamune pioneered were directly responsive to problems identified during the Mongol invasions. Traditional tachi were forged using a relatively simple structure, a hard cutting edge backed by softer, more flexible steel. This worked well for the cutting-focused combat against unarmored or lightly armored opponents that characterized internal Japanese warfare. But Mongol soldiers often wore multiple layers of hardened leather armor, sometimes reinforced with metal plates or scales. Striking such armor repeatedly could damage the crystalline structure of traditional blades, causing chips along the cutting edge, or, in extreme cases, catastrophic breaks. Masamune developed a more sophisticated laminated structure using multiple grades of steel. The cutting edge remained extremely hard, capable of taking and holding a razor-sharp edge, but the transition between hard edge and soft spine became more gradual, with intermediate layers of steel that distributed stress more effectively. This prevented the kind of sudden failures that had plagued earlier blades. The visible result was the distinctive heimen, the temper line that ran along the blade's length, which became more complex and beautiful in Masamune's work than anything that had come before. The forging process itself was extraordinarily demanding. Starting with Tamahagan steel, iron sand smelted in traditional furnaces, the smith would fold and forge the metal repeatedly, creating thousands of layers. Different grades of steel would be combined, each requiring precise temperature control during heating and hammering. The blade would be shaped through endless hours of careful work, then coated in clay in preparation for the critical hardening process. The clay coating was thicker along the spine and thinner along the edge. When the blade was heated to critical temperature and then quenched in water, the edge cooled rapidly, creating hard martensitic steel, while the spine cooled more slowly, remaining softer and more flexible. This differential hardening created the blade's curve and gave it the combination of hardness and resilience that made Japanese swords unique. But Masamune and his contemporaries refined every aspect of this process. The exact composition of the clay coating, the temperature of heating, the speed and angle of quenching, the tempering process that followed, all of these variables were optimized based on studying how blades performed in actual combat against Mongol forces. The resulting weapons were measurably superior to what had come before. Blades could be thinner and lighter while maintaining the same or better structural strength. They held their edges longer during sustained combat. They were less likely to chip or break when striking hard materials, and they were, by all accounts, devastatingly effective cutting weapons. A properly forged and wielded tachi from this period could sever a limb with a single stroke, cut through leather armor, split a skull, or open wounds that would kill within minutes. The geometry of the blade, its curve and balance allowed for cuts of extraordinary speed and power. The samurai's two-handed grip provided leverage that could generate cutting forces far exceeding what was possible with one-handed swords, and the technique, developed over centuries of internal warfare and then refined by combat against foreign invaders, allowed skilled warriors to deliver these cuts with lethal precision. Stories from the period, while often exaggerated, give us glimpses of what these weapons could do in skilled hands. There are accounts of samurai cutting through 3 bodies with a single stroke, of blades that could slice through an armoured opponent's shoulder and emerge from the opposite hip, of warriors who could kill multiple enemies in seconds with a flurry of precisely aimed cuts. The Mongol invasions also affected the martial culture surrounding the sword in less tangible but equally important ways. Before 1274, the emphasis in samurai culture was heavily on archery. The bow was considered the primary weapon of the mounted warrior, with the sword serving mainly as a backup for close combat. The invasions, where Japanese archers were often outranged and outmatched by Mongol composite bows, diminished the bow's prestige somewhat. Meanwhile, the effectiveness of sword work in close quarters combat, particularly during the night raids on Mongol ships, elevated the sword's status. By the 14th century, swordsmanship was beginning its transformation into the central martial art of the samurai class, the skill that more than any other defined a warrior's prowess. This shift had profound cultural implications. Archery, while demanding great skill, was ultimately a ranged weapon that killed at a distance. Swordsmanship required facing your enemy within arm's reach, seeing their eyes, hearing their breath, feeling the resistance as your blade cut through their body. It was intimate, visceral, and psychologically intense in ways that archery was not. The spiritual dimensions of Japanese swordsmanship, which would reach their full development in later centuries, had their roots in this period. The idea that swordsmanship was a path to self-knowledge, that the perfection of technique led to the perfection of character, that the sword was a mirror reflecting the warrior's soul, all of these concepts began to crystallize in the generations following the Mongol invasions. Zen Buddhism, which had been introduced to Japan from China in earlier centuries, became increasingly influential among the samurai class during this period. The Zen emphasis on direct experience, on discipline and self-control, on the paradoxical unity of opposites, meshed perfectly with the demands of swordsmanship. The meditative focus required to forge a perfect blade paralleled the mental discipline required to wield one effectively in combat. Master swordsmiths often practiced Zen meditation, seeing their craft as a spiritual path as much as a technical skill. Warriors did the same, understanding that technical proficiency with the sword was insufficient without the mental clarity and emotional control that came from spiritual practice. This synthesis of martial skill and spiritual development, which would become one of the defining characteristics of samurai culture, was accelerated by the experience of the Mongol invasions. Warriors who had faced death against a foreign enemy, who had seen friends cut down and had killed enemies in brutal close combat, returned home with a different understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. The formal duels and ritualized challenges of earlier eras seemed inadequate to prepare men for the kind of warfare the Mongols had brought to Japan. What was needed was a deeper transformation, a cultivation of the warrior spirit that went beyond mere technical skill. The sword, as the most personal and demanding of weapons, became the focus of this transformation. By the mid-14th century, the tachi had evolved in both physical form and cultural significance. Physically, the innovations pioneered during the invasion era had become standard. Blades were generally lighter, slightly shorter than earlier models, with more balanced curves and refined geometry. The quality of steel and forging technique had improved to the point where a well-made blade could last for generations if properly cared for. Culturally, the sword had become the ultimate symbol of samurai identity. A warrior's blade was his most precious possession, valued above horses, armor, or land. Swords were given names, their histories recorded, their makers celebrated. The most famous blades were known throughout Japan, their reputations enhancing the status of whoever possessed them. This wasn't mere fetishization of weapons. It reflected a genuine understanding that superior swords provided real advantages in combat. A warrior carrying a Masamune blade or another sword from a celebrated smith wasn't just displaying wealth or status. He was carrying a weapon that was measurably more effective than cheaper alternatives. In a society where combat prowess determined social position, and where a warrior might be called to risk his life at any moment, possessing the best possible weapon was a rational priority. The emphasis on sword quality also reflected the samurai class's growing professionalism. These weren't part-time soldiers or feudal levies. They were career warriors from families that had been fighting for generations. They understood weapons the way craftsmen understood tools, intimately and practically. The legacy of the Mongol invasions extended far beyond the immediate military and technical innovations. The experience of facing foreign conquest attempt fundamentally shaped Japanese attitudes toward the outside world for centuries. The belief that Japan was divinely protected, that the kamikaze storms represented supernatural intervention, reinforced a sense of Japanese uniqueness and cultural superiority. This belief system, whatever its historical accuracy, provided psychological comfort and cultural cohesion. It also contributed to a certain insularity. If divine forces protected Japan from foreign threats, why engage extensively with the outside world? The Tokugawa shogunate's later policies of national isolation, while driven by many factors, were certainly influenced by the historical memory of successfully resisting foreign invasion. The Mongol invasions also established precedents for military organization and national defense that influenced Japanese strategic thinking for centuries. The construction of the defensive wall at Hakata Bay demonstrated the value of prepared fortifications, the organization of warrior groups under centralized command. Even if imperfectly implemented, provided a model for later military reforms, but perhaps most importantly, the invasions created a shared national experience that transcended regional and clan loyalties. Samurai from across Kyushu and beyond had fought together against a common enemy. They had shared the terror of facing Mongol arrows and explosives, the triumph of successful night raids, the relief of surviving the storms that destroyed the invasion fleets. This shared experience created bonds and stories that became part of the collective memory of the samurai class. The tales of the Mongol invasions were told and retold, each generation adding their own interpretations and emphasis. By the 16th century, these stories had become foundational myths of samurai culture. Warriors studying swordsmanship learned not just technique but history, understanding how their art had been refined through combat against the greatest military power of the 13th century. The physical evidence of the invasions remained visible for centuries. The stone wall at Hakata Bay stood as a monument to Japanese resistance. Weapons and armor recovered from Mongol ships were preserved in temples and collections, and most enduringly, the swords forged in response to the invasion survived. Many of them still exist today, treasured as national artifacts. Modern metallurgical analysis of blades from the late Kamakura period confirms what historical accounts suggested. The swords forged in the decades following the Mongol invasions represent a peak in Japanese sword-making technology. The steel structure visible under microscopic examination shows extraordinary sophistication, with layers of different grades of steel precisely welded together. The crystalline structure of the cutting edge optimized for hardness and sharpness, The spine and core designed for flexibility and impact resistance. These weren't primitive weapons. They were the products of centuries of accumulated knowledge, refined by master craftsmen working at the absolute peak of their abilities, using techniques that in some ways exceeded what modern technology could achieve until recently. The cultural reverence for these blades isn't misplaced romanticism. These were genuinely remarkable objects representing the highest expression of pre-industrial metallurgy anywhere in the world. When we examine the Mongol invasions through the lens of sword development, we see a clear narrative of challenge and response. The initial invasions exposed weaknesses in Japanese weapons and tactics. These weaknesses were studied, understood and addressed through innovation in forging techniques and combat training. The resulting weapons were measurably superior, better adapted to the specific demands of fighting heavily armoured opponents in chaotic melee combat. This process of refinement through combat experience isn't unique to Japan. Every military tradition improves its weapons based on battlefield performance. What makes the Japanese case remarkable is the speed and sophistication of the response, and the fact that we can trace the evolution through surviving artifacts and detailed historical records. The Mokoshurai Ekotoba, the illustrated scrolls commissioned by Takazaki Suenaga, provide an invaluable window into this process. We can see the weapons used, the armour worn, the tactics employed. We can compare these contemporary images with earlier and later depictions and trace the evolution of equipment and technique. The scrolls show us samurai wielding their long tachi from horseback, the blades curved and ready. They show close combat on the decks of ships where the sword's reach advantage proved decisive. They show the chaos and violence of medieval warfare stripped of later romanticization. These images remind us that for all the spiritual significance and cultural meaning attached to Japanese swords, they were fundamentally weapons, tools designed to kill efficiently. The beauty of their construction, the elegance of their form, the philosophical meaning attributed to them, all of this was built on a foundation of practical effectiveness in combat. The samurai who fought at Hakata Bay weren't philosophers contemplating the nature of the warrior spirit. They were professional soldiers fighting for their lives against an enemy that had conquered half the world. The swords they carried were the tools they depended on for survival. That some of those swords survive today, carefully preserved in museums and private collections, provides a tangible connection to those desperate battles. We can examine the blades that were actually present at the invasions, see the wear patterns from use, sometimes even see damage from combat. These aren't abstract historical artifacts. They're objects that were there, wielded by men whose names we sometimes know, used to kill enemies whose bones were found in the archaeological excavations of Mongol mass graves at Hakata Bay. The Mongol invasions also influenced the development of other aspects of samurai equipment beyond just swords. Armour design evolved to better resist the armour-piercing arrows used by Mongol archers. The Japanese began using their own explosive weapons, having captured and studied the Mongol devices. Ship design improved to create the fast, manoeuvrable vessels used in the night raids, but it's the sword that captured and held cultural imagination, perhaps because it was the most personal weapon, the one that required the most skill, the one that represented the warrior's individual capability rather than technological advantage. A samurai with a superior bow still needed arrows and could be undone by wind or rain. A samurai with a superior sword carried that advantage with him always, a permanent extension of his own skill and determination. This personal connection between warrior and weapon became increasingly emphasized in the centuries following the invasions. By the Muromachi period in the 14th and 15th centuries, the sword had become the paramount symbol of samurai status. The saying that the sword is the soul of the samurai emerged during this era, reflecting how completely the weapon had become identified with the warrior class. This identification was practical as much as symbolic. As Japan descended into the chaos of the Sengoku period in the late 15th century, warfare became more common and more brutal. The refined battlefield etiquette of earlier eras disappeared entirely. Combat became about survival and victory by any means necessary. In this environment, having a reliable, high-quality sword was literally a life or death matter. Warriors who could afford blades from celebrated smiths, or from the earlier Kamakura period masters, paid extraordinary sums for them. These weren't luxury purchases, they were investments in the most important tool of their trade. The technical knowledge developed in response to the Mongol invasions was carefully guarded and passed down through generations of swordsmiths. The great sword-making families like the Masamune school became institutions, with master smiths taking on apprentices who would spend decades learning the craft. The process couldn't be rushed. The metallurgical knowledge required years to acquire. The physical skill to forge, shape, and polish a blade demanded endless practice. The judgment to know when the steel was at the right temperature, when to quench, how to adjust technique for different grades of ore, this was experiential knowledge that could only be learned through long apprenticeship with a master. By the 16th century, swordmaking had become one of the most prestigious crafts in Japan, with successful smiths achieving social status that approached that of samurai themselves. The best blades were worth fortunes, with daimyo competing to possess swords by famous makers. This wasn't mere collecting. These warlords were fighting constantly and needed the best weapons available. A daimyo who could equip his best warriors with superior swords gained a measurable advantage. Word would spread that a particular lord's retainers carried Masamune blades or other celebrated swords, and this reputation enhanced the lord's prestige while deterring potential enemies. The evolution of Japanese swords continued through the Muromachi and into the Momoyama period, with different schools developing regional variations in style and technique. But the fundamental advances pioneered in response to the Mongol invasions remained the foundation. The sophisticated steel structure, the differential hardening, the careful attention to geometry and balance, all the innovations that emerged from studying how blades performed against Mongol forces continued to define Japanese swordmaking. When firearms arrived in Japan in the 16th century, brought by Portuguese traders, the sword's military significance began to decline. Arquebuses could kill at range with minimal training, making them attractive for armies increasingly composed of Ashigaru foot soldiers rather than samurai. But this actually elevated the sword's symbolic importance. As its practical military role decreased, its cultural significance increased. The sword became less a tool of war and more a symbol of status and tradition. The Tokugawa period beginning in 1603 brought peace to Japan after centuries of warfare. Samurai became administrators and bureaucrats more than fighters. Many would go their entire lives without drawing their swords in combat. But the swords remained central to samurai identity, worn as marks of their status, maintained with ritual care, studied through kata that preserved combat techniques even when actual combat became rare. The peaceful centuries of Tokugawa rule allowed sword appreciation to develop into a refined art form. Connoisseurs studied the subtle variations between different schools and periods, learning to identify makers by the characteristics of their work. The blades from the Kamakura period, forged in the crucible of the Mongol invasions and their aftermath, were recognized as representing the peak of the smith's art. These koto, or old swords, became the most prized possessions in Japan, their value increasing as they became rarer. Many were destroyed in fires, lost in conflicts, or simply wore out from centuries of polishing. Those that survived became national treasures, literally irreplaceable artifacts of Japanese cultural heritage. When Japan ended its isolation in the 19th century and modernized rapidly during the Meiji period, the samurai class was abolished. The wearing of swords in public was banned. The entire social structure that had sustained sword-making for centuries disappeared almost overnight. Many smiths abandoned their craft. The technical knowledge, so carefully preserved for generations, was in danger of being lost. But something remarkable happened. The cultural significance of the Japanese sword proved strong enough to survive the destruction of the social class that had created it. Sword-making continued initially to preserve a dying art, but gradually finding new purpose as Japanese swords came to represent Japanese cultural identity itself. The blades weren't just weapons or even just historical artifacts. They were embodiments of Japanese aesthetics, Japanese craftsmanship, Japanese spiritual values. During the militaristic period leading to World War II, the sword regained some of its martial significance. Officers carried swords, though many were machine-made imitations rather than traditionally forged blades. The wartime demand for swords led to a brief revival of traditional sword-making, though under rushed conditions that often compromised quality. After Japan's defeat in 1945, the Allied occupation forces banned sword production and confiscated many blades. Countless irreplaceable historical swords were destroyed, cut up, or shipped out of Japan. It was a cultural catastrophe, the destruction in a few years of artifacts that had survived for centuries. But again, the tradition proved resilient. As the occupation ended and Japan regained sovereignty, restrictions on sword-making were gradually lifted. Smiths who had maintained their skills in secret could work openly again. Young craftsmen began apprenticing, learning the traditional techniques. Today, Japanese sword-making is recognized as an intangible cultural heritage. Master smiths continue working using the same basic techniques developed centuries ago. They smelt Tamahagan steel in traditional furnaces, forge blades through endless folding and hammering, perform the critical hardening process using methods that would be recognizable to Masamune. The tradition that began in prehistory, that was refined through centuries of internal warfare, that was transformed by the experience of facing Mongol invaders, continues into the 21st century. Modern smiths create blades that aren't intended for combat, but are nevertheless forged to the same exacting standards as weapons that saw actual use in medieval battlefields. The techniques developed in response to the Mongol invasions, the sophisticated steel structures, the differential hardening, the careful attention to geometry, all of this continues. A blade forged today by a master smith using traditional methods would be immediately recognizable to a samurai from the Kamakura period and would perform identically to the swords carried at Hakata Bay 7.5 centuries ago. This continuity of tradition across such vast stretches of time is remarkable. How many other crafts can claim unbroken lineages extending back to the 13th century? How many other technologies continue using pre-industrial methods not out of nostalgia, but because those methods genuinely produce results that modern techniques cannot match? The Japanese sword stands almost alone in this regard, a technology so thoroughly refined by centuries of use and improvement that it achieved a kind of perfection that industrialization couldn't improve upon. When we return to that November morning in 1274 at Hakata Bay, when Takashi Suenaga and thousands of other samurai faced the Mongol invasion fleet, we can now understand the full significance of that moment. It wasn't just a military confrontation. It was a collision of cultures, a test of Japanese traditions against foreign methods, a crucible that would transform both Japanese warfare and Japanese culture. The tachi swords those warriors carried represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and skill. The blades that would emerge from the lessons of that conflict and its successor in 1281 would represent a quantum leap forward. Weapons optimized through combat experience against the most formidable enemy Japan had ever faced. The samurai who survived those battles brought home knowledge purchased with blood. Their society listened, adapted, and improved. The swordsmiths took the lessons of combat failure and success and translated them into metallurgical innovation. The result was a tradition of weapon making that would become one of the defining characteristics of Japanese culture. 750 years later, we can still examine the physical evidence of this process. Museums around the world hold tachi and katana from the Kamakura period and later. We can see the evolution of form and technique, trace how combat experience shaped design, understand how the specific challenge of fighting Mongol forces drove specific innovations. These aren't abstract historical questions. The answers exist in the objects themselves, in the metal forged and shaped and sharpened centuries ago, preserved through generations of care and respect. The Mongol invasions failed. The storms that destroyed the invasion fleets entered Japanese mythology as evidence of divine protection. But the more profound legacy wasn't supernatural. It was the transformation of Japanese military culture and technology in response to existential threat. The samurai class proved capable of learning from defeat, of setting aside traditional methods that didn't work, of innovating while maintaining continuity with their traditions. The swords they carried and the techniques they used to wield them evolved to meet new challenges while remaining recognizably Japanese, distinctly products of a unique cultural tradition. That tradition, forged in the desperate battles of the Mongol invasions and refined through centuries of subsequent development, continues today. Every Japanese sword made using traditional methods carries within it the lessons learned when samurai first faced Mongol invaders with drawn tachi, when the curved blades of Japan met the armor and weapons of the Mongol Empire, and when the outcome of those encounters drove innovations that would define Japanese sword-making forever.